Hi, I'm Katie Watson, and welcome back to another episode of Cybersecurity in Focus. Today's episode is a really fun one because we go from vibe coding and AI built MVPs all the way down to the fundamentals that still catch teams out today. Things like code review, credentials, and the old vulnerabilities that never really went away. I'm joined by John Boero, a dual US UK citizen with over 20 years in tech, consulting globally on infrastructure, HPC, security, and virtualization and containerization. John's worked at Red Hat, Puppet, HashiCorp, and multiple consultancies, so he's seen the patterns repeat themselves across industries and continents. John and I talk about the quiet risks that show up when speed increases, how DevSecOps can work with developers instead of against them, and why sometimes the smartest question is actually a very simple one. Is this really broken? So without further ado, let's get into it. Hi, John. Thank you for joining me all the way from Malaysia. How are you today?
Hello, Katie. I'm well, thank you.
We've got a super interesting conversation today. We're going to go everything from vibe coding to DevSecOps, exploring the relationship between the teams. So I think we'll just jump straight in. John, you've got so much experience. You've worked in low Linux environments to global cloud platforms. The question I want to kick off with is technology has changed so much. Is there a pattern that you see repeating itself despite all this change?
There is. In fact, I see this vibe coding, as we're going to discuss, has actually reintroduced a lot of options that people never really appreciated. Been in tech really since about 2001, when we were shifting from writing, application code that would run on your own machine to thin clients, web applications. I went through SOAP, which was XML, and now JSON, and essentially the evolution of REST APIs as they've got up till now. And I see a lot of returning to the basis, right? We have a new generation coming in that doesn't remember the old ways. And they think they discovered something new. Well, this is how we did things years ago, right? So we have a new generation, and it's fortunately powered by vibe coding. And I am surprisingly a fan of vibe coding.
Really? I think so. What is that kind of new generation? Because I remember I saw you did a talk. It must have been like more than 2 years ago. And I was absolutely fascinated. I think you showed a hack and it was like a packet hack and it just released and released. And you were like, this is old school. And is there anything the new generation need to be aware of?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is chronic old man syndrome in the industry, right? A lot of people that have been around since the days of assembly and C and C++, they know certain tricks and hacks that were essentially patched or sorted out years ago, and we have a new generation that doesn't like to do low-level coding, and they suddenly find new vulnerabilities, and they find that they are vulnerable to certain things that they didn't anticipate. So you have to take a blend of old approach and new approach. And again, the good news is all this AI can figure this out, right? We're seeing AI's models essentially evolve today that can scan your code, find 200 vulnerabilities that nobody previously reported, right? So I tend to have a background consulting or approaching things from two different sides, security and performance, right? And I guess the third tier, the easy coding, right? So we have a generation that only values Python coding, and they don't necessarily need to worry about performance. Well, there's certain security implications there, and there's certain performance implications there. And the fact that we have AI now, which can do everything from take an English sentence and compile it down to an assembly days, right? To AI that can be both an old man and a new young entry-level coder, right, with fresh education from university. So in order to cover the next generation, you're going to need some form of AI. And I remember, I think that talk you're talking about, that was actually early stage AI. Could it solve this problem? And yeah, in a lot of cases it couldn't. It wasn't there yet. But these days, the models are catching up. Everything is very much more niche now. So it's a really impressive way to see it evolve.
Yeah, I think you really capture that as well. The speed at which technology is changing and AI is evolving is so fascinating. And with that, I guess that does introduce risks, I guess. And it's quite quiet because it is very shiny and new, and you can very much get absorbed by the glamour of AI and how quickly you can code something. I mean, I'm just seeing some amazing stuff being built just through vibe coding. What, from an infrastructure perspective, from your side, what are those quiet risks that you think security teams or DevSecOps need to be aware of, and even the developers themselves before pushing product or meeting deadlines?
So, it's kind of interesting how quickly you can do something, but then the lost art of code review is the problem, right? Yes, I've got this application put together really quickly. Yes, it does what I want, and that's great. Let's ship it. Like, well, I hate to say, I've worked both in Europe for 10 years and the US for about the same, actually, about 10 years. And the difference in security posture is amazing between the US and outside the US. Right? So we went from, on an infrastructure sense, DMs, golden image strategies, and then we pivoted to DevOps, everything as code, right? So when I worked at Red Hat, Puppet, and HashiCorp, and saw this progression of DevOps. And in the early days, even our own employees, we had new hires, junior new hires that would join, see some code on GitHub, public GitHub, right? Which is very American. European companies are still very closed loop. They like to have their own private repos, their own private code base. And these interns would take a bit of code, paste it into their own repo, and cool, this is a demonstration of Terraform. I've deployed an application. Right? And probably in the early days, maybe once a week, someone would accidentally post their GitHub credentials to public repos, right? And the entire organization gets shut down and restart. Like I got tired of it, honestly. I would switch. I switched if could. Just because everybody's using AWS, I'm going to pivot to Azure or Google because nobody's using it as much, and we're not leaking credentials as much. Right? So we have this era of infrastructure code copying from public repos, sharing public data, making mistakes, and sharing credentials. We obviously had to evolve that into DevSecOps and really being aware of what you're posting, and also limiting and such, essentially doing a pre-hook to say, okay, are you sharing anything sensitive? And that's not always clear, right? In fact, now we have AI models that can scan your code and say, you're about to do something, go, about to share something that should be internal only. So that is a huge boost for AI and security. More so when it comes to security, people are worried about what can it do to attack me. So we have a lot of people using current models for pen testing. And that's kind of one of the scenarios I used in the earlier talk. And it was crazy, but this is almost 2 years ago now. Yeah, I've been off for almost a year and a half in Asia. And I've been blessed, by the way. So I've been having a lot of fun. But I'm coming home soon, and I've been keeping up with this. I have to keep up with this when we get back into the industry. And to see the evolution of a pen test AI, say, here's how I would attack you, here's how I would do this and that. That's the preliminary kind of evaluation by a model, in particular an agentic model, right? Because back when I gave the last talk, we had no agents. We had, here's a local model, here's a private entity we're talking to, essentially an auto completion model, right? It only knows what it was trained on, right? Well, today's models and actually the platforms that they run on do the next step. They say, okay, pause. In order to complete this statement, this answer, I'm going to need to go web search on this documentation, right? And it actually will blend the current data out there with the model in a way that is much more powerful. So yeah, I remember there were a lot of questions in these early talks about like what if somebody in my team or my application team uses vibe coding to quickly put out an app. What are the odds that the model will be out to get me? Right, the model will be malicious and have intentions to compromise our systems. And in the early days, that was about prompting. It sounds stupid, but add a prompt. Yeah, do not screw me. Right? Do not screw me over. Do not try to defeat the system. You literally tell a model as part of the prompt, like, do not attack me. You're my friend. And that actually has an impact. And now it's like, use whatever resources you can, not just the model. And that's much more powerful. So it's really come a long way. And I'm a big fan. I know a lot of people are still skeptical, but I am a big fan. For myself, I've used it for building really I keep saying my bar napkin list, right? Things that your serviettes that you write an idea. I would like to make this app someday, but I don't have the time. And I have like 10 applications, not all web applications, right? Even applications in a PC. And again, going from a thick client to here's a half a megabyte, here's 500K of Python that does the job of a 600 megabyte web client, right? I hate to say, I would love to see this year, 2026, the death of Electron. Are you familiar with Electron applications?
I'm not familiar. So, for those listeners who probably know what it is, but maybe for some of us who don't, if you give a bit of a debrief of what that is.
Yeah, right. So Electron applications are the biggest step backwards in technology I think I've seen in the last decade, right? You have developers that used to make a thick, like a Windows application or a PC application or like a platform neutral point and click UI, right? And they take that and they put it a web front end. Right? Forget that. We'll get rid of the thick client, the application you install. We want to use the browser. So we'll make a web application. And then you have customers that say, actually, I need a native application. Oh, let's just package a web browser with the application. So what should be a simple app, right? 1 megabyte turns into 600 megabytes of dependencies, and then you fire it up, and it runs slow, and it takes a gig of RAM. It's like this is ridiculous, right? This is using old technology to run a local client with a web application and a local client. It's combining the worst of both options, and that's got to end. It's going to end I hope in this year. I never want to see another application package in Electron after 2026 because frankly, it's unnecessary. Ask the AI. I have this web application. Can you make this a local application? And it does it in minutes now. It's amazing. So much more efficient.
It's education maybe because like you said, it's like the client, sometimes it's the client asking for that stuff. And I think in
Yeah.
these positions you
Yeah.
need to be like able to say like, look, this was the old way of doing it, this is the new way, and then also provide the confidence and the security, just explain
Yes.
this is secure, this is how we're doing it. Because I think it's so interesting, you've got the skeptics, you've got the enthusiasts, you've also got, from the security side, there is concern around AI, there's concern around things like LLM poisoning, particularly, if you're trying to use open source things, if you're trying to use very much publicly available information, that is like the new threat vector there is, how if you can't change the prompt that the AI uses, change where they get the information from. And that's like something
Yes.
we're starting to see as well. So I think there's a massive education piece here to drive that change. And it's about being really like, this is the better way to do it. But like being really clear on making sure you do both the secure side, but also the fun side as well, like the fun vibe coding, the speed in which you can do change, the rate in which you can have someone test something now is so fast. You can, really, you can build an MVP so quickly. You can get actual feedback on the day and make those changes. So it's an exciting time, but it's also, you've got to do it in a secure fashion.
Yes, yes, and it's interesting to see, everybody was big on ChatGPT 3 when it came out. I remember the first time 3 came out. Actually, just before 3 came out, a friend of mine approached me about a startup like, look, you can just type English and out comes Terraform, right? And that essentially eliminates Terraform, right? I don't need to see the Terraform to say, okay, deploy this application for me in the cloud. And any idiot can type that and get infrastructure in the cloud. And then another friend of mine in Portugal, actually, a Ukrainian, brilliant, showed me AI ops, chat ops, essentially, right? So you're chatting with the bot. You're saying, okay, what regions is this application available in? You don't have to know the CLI. You don't have to be certified on anything. If the model can do that for you, right? You get to speak human and get results. And that, in some ways, that's a threat to an entire industry, right? That's what we do professionally. In other ways, it's like, well, you can embrace it or you can be afraid of it. And if you're afraid of it, you're going to get steamrolled, right? So I saw the positive. I'm like, this is actually going to be the way that people interact with resources very soon. And it's funny that that was now 3 years ago, I think, when I saw the first run of that. And it hasn't, the big cloud providers are all pushing for their own models. Nobody within those cloud providers our hyperscalers are actually taking that on, as far as I can see. Right? This is a third party thing. You'd be able to chat, say, deploy this there. A lot of the people that were getting elite contracts for premium Terraform skills or order of Terraform skills in my mind goes writing Terraform, right? Writing modules, writing providers, right? And we had part of the partner network, like nobody at core companies, Puppet or HashiCorp would necessarily be like the low level code that would be put out to partners.
Yeah.
And now the fact that you can not just ask for an AI to write you a bit of Terraform or a bit of deployment code, you can also say, actually, I need this provider for something that doesn't exist yet, and it will just come out. That is a threat to a lot of expensive contracts. You have to embrace it, like automatic transmission on a car, right? Guess what? You don't have to do a manual gearbox anymore. Some people like to be purists and like to stay and write their own code or shift their own gears, but the industry will pivot to easy. And in the world of all these high tech hardware companies, Nvidia and Intel and essentially AMD fighting it out for the next leading GPU, language is easy, right? LLMs are established. I don't need the latest NVIDIA GPU to do an LLM, right? All the new kit and all those NV72s, whatever the big boxes that cost $500,000 or more, those are the kinds of machines that will do video and pictures. You can run your own machine, your own LLM, if you're really conscious about data sharing and you don't want your data shared with a public model like Claude, Opus, or ChatGPT. You can run your own model locally, really easy. And I was an early contributor to Llama CPP. That is the engine that was enabled essentially by Meta to run your own LLM, right? Really security conscious people will still prefer that because it turns out that a lot of your chats get shared even after you said no sharing. And to be fair, Microsoft is really good at this because Microsoft values the enterprise businesses says you cannot use my prompt history at all, my chat history at all, and you get your own private LLM. Right? That's their focus. Every model, every startup, even the ones that are purged, burning through billions of dollars of capital every year, most valuable thing to them is the user history, right? Because that helps them improve the model and get the next result. So they're all fighting to have the best model. Your data is their biggest resource. And they're not trying to compromise their security. But yeah, if you share secure or sensitive data in a chat, you should anticipate that SaaS, that provider will be using that to train the next model. Even as much as a thumb up, thumbs down, right? Gemini, I know, has a really convenient thumbs up, thumbs down. That
Yeah.
that was actually really useful.
That's so interesting. I always think about, at the end of the day, these models are always training themselves. And even if you think it's secure, like sometimes it's not. And there's this whole new generation learning about all this stuff so quickly through other mediums. And it really is, I think, that getting that level of education across the whole board so everyone understands, things are changing, but they're not being done, what you might think is secure, paying for the enterprise license and then uploading your data is maybe not as secure as the alternative. And there are alternatives, and it does come to that communication side. I don't know if you have any tips or advice or even like things you've seen in the past work well of how to communicate within different departments of the organization to have that shared objective.
Yeah, so I worked at some of the biggest banks in the world, either consulting or architecture, right? And size is your enemy, right? The bigger the group, the more chaotic the communication. And there was also one of the biggest banks in, I want to say, in South Africa, and they, to be fair, I think had the most amazing collaborative team and DevOps strategy in the world. They actually sat at a desk together, in the same office, comfortably. There were 6 people. Two of them would come up with the code, submit a pull request, just literally across the table. Hey, can you review this? There's no chat ops, there's no workflow, there's no click, send this person a notification. It's just, hey, can you take a look at this? And okay, yeah, it was merged within 5 minutes of being written. And like that is the fastest I've seen anyone move efficiently, right? They go to the bigger banks in London, Canary Wharf, and okay, we have to send this to the other team. And we returned to the office, so we're still in the office. But guess what? Well, we're 3 floors up from the other team, so we have to arrange a meeting. There's no bigger killer of efficiency than having a meeting required to do something.
Yeah.
So I'm not for remote work or work from the office, return to office, but you have to be in a small enough group and independent enough in a small group to be able to do something. Seeking 3 levels of approvals is required by some people, maybe for compliance or for some financial authority, but you have to be able to do that in an efficient way. And I've seen everything from I need a firewall rule added. Well, the firewall guy left for holiday for 2 weeks. Good luck. I've been paid large amounts of money to sit around and wait 2 weeks for the firewall guy to come back from vacation. To the 5 minutes, here we go, 5 minutes. It's in the changes in production. It's amazing, and yeah, the quick team can roll out a mistake or malicious code by mistake. They have to have the ability to roll that back. We see this not just at banks, financial institutions, and customers, but also cloud providers. Look at Cloudflare, right? Look at all the big CDNs in the world. Consistently, they have good quality control in place. They have good testing, and you roll a change to production, and you bring down half the planet, right?
Yeah.
I hate to say DevOps, I think, was one of the biggest double-edged swords that infected the industry, right? And you introduce that into a global backbone like one of the CDNs or one of the hyperscalers, you're going to have massive outages. So I loved how European customers, compared to American customers consulting, you want to have something on premise. I had, again, one of the biggest 4 banks in the world. I had a 2-month consulting session. Should we move this application to the cloud or not? Or should we keep it on premise? And they sat down with me. I said, how many users of this application? Oh, these are our billionaires. We have 30 people or something using this application. Like, okay, when was the last time it went down? Never. Like, okay, so it doesn't need to be scalable, and it's already highly available. And you're asking me if it should be moved to cloud. So you want to do an entire digital migration to cloud, but it already works fine. They're like, no, why mess with it? It works. That was like a 2-month engagement. I just finished this in 5 minutes. There's no justification for moving a perfectly good application into cloud, especially when the user base is a limited set. So oftentimes, be terrible at sales because sell me 2 months. I will solve what you need in 1 week. Why do you need to sell me for 2 months? Right? It's really simple. It's not rocket science.
That's so interesting. I think that I guess that's such an interesting approach because you just looked at like, is it broken? Like, is this broken? Is this situation, does it need change? And I think that is probably a question that not is like, was applicable in that situation. And I can imagine for anyone listening, they probably do have a bit of a headache right now, like in their, organization. There is a problem. You need to fix this. I guess the first question you probably need to
Yes.
ask is, what is actually broken? Is it,
Yes.
why do you want to do, so when you come in and you do consulting for organizations, what is the first thing you actually, I appreciate it will depend on the context, but what's the first thing you look at to decide what to do? Because like you said, you can solve it in like 5 minutes sometimes.
Yeah, it's like this is a pizza meeting, right? We don't need to sit here for 2 weeks and figure this out. I can see it's a problem. And one time I got sent to the Middle East, an emergency actually. And it was the opposite. It was the security team that was trying to require something that was not physically possible. We have an HPC cluster. We have 12,000 physical servers that have local identity, and the security team is saying, no, we need to centralize this identity on a directory server, right? On LDAP or IPA server. So our security policy states that this, and in doing that, they have. I can see on again. First half an hour, what's going on? The security team was requiring the infrastructure team to do something, to change something. The infrastructure team runs a sudden job that gets broadcast out to 12,000 physical servers. All the lights dim in the room because they're using megawatts of electricity. And at the same millisecond, 12,000 servers go to the identity server. Boom, it's gone, right? DDoS, they distributed denial of service on their own servers. And of course, they fall over at the same time to the backup server, and they destroy that one. Guys, this is never going to work. I can see in the first half an hour of 2 weeks, this is never going to work. This is a terrible idea. And they said, yeah, well, can you just write that down for us and show? Yes, our opinion is that this is not a good use case for HPC. You cannot do this because it's just never going to work. And again, I got sent down to the desert to spend 2 weeks when like a 1 hour meeting would have been enough to see that this is a problem. And all they wanted was just to say, admit this doesn't work. Perfect. Okay. We've had it. So security can both enable things and they can restrict things, right? And often, I don't want to say one team is right or wrong because you have compliance and you have worries. In fact, I just did a workshop a couple of weeks ago with the spread team around Europe, and half the French team couldn't complete the workshop. Like, well, this isn't working. Well, our GitHub accounts are restricted by our company. We cannot do certain things.
Yeah.
That's a reasonable concern. That's a reasonable, I'm sorry, I didn't realize what was going wrong. It took us an hour to troubleshoot what was going wrong, but their actual company policy was blocking a public workshop. And I can't fault their security team, right? That's their need, because you have hedge funds that are accidentally or intentionally shipping really valuable proprietary code to public servers. And there has to be a balance. There's no right or wrong, as long as, I hate to say, the wrong thing is suddenly getting a $200 million fine, or you're having a breach that costs you $1 million, right? And that's what everybody's trying to prevent.
That's something that coming across in a lot of the conversations I'm having is there is no right and wrong. It depends on the organization, but overall, it's like you need to have that shared goal, because there is that like one bad. There's the one bad thing. There's the having a breach. There's actually sometimes I think we will be like verse each other in an organization. My team versus your team. I want this, you want that. You're not letting me do that. We forget that actually there's a wider picture, and there's a more of a collective goal of making sure servers don't go down, preventing attacks. And sometimes it's coming back to that being like, okay, first of all, is it possible what we're trying to achieve? As you've shown, it's a very valid question to ask. And then it's asking, okay, how can we achieve this in a way that we both win?
That is the golden rule in one sentence, right? How do we do this efficiently without leaking or without compromising, obviously, our data? We had a session once with a sales motivational speaker, essentially, and it always sounded so taboo to me to have the session with the team building session with a public speaker. He was from the U.S. actually, but he asked the question, and everybody felt like such idiots. What is the most important bit of a data center? And people are thinking, the network guys are thinking the network, and the storage guys are thinking the storage, and the data. The data this has to be processed efficiently, effectively, and securely, right? It's like, oh yeah, it's an abstract concept, but the important bit of a data center is the data. You come from a world where, in my opinion, if you're a recruiter right now looking for your next talent in the infrastructure space or the software space, I think the biggest crime against the industry in the past decade is a recruiter saying, oh, I don't see much activity on your GitHub. Okay, well, guess what? Not everybody has public code. And in Europe especially, we have private code bases, we have private repos, private servers, GitLab, GitHub, Enterprise, because we don't want that thing to happen. My employer does not want us accidentally contributing public code or proprietary code, right? In addition to banks, right, there's the underworld of hedge funds and trading companies. My favorite scenario is actually HFT, right? High frequency trading. So we have to trade at the nanosecond level of application performance, right? The code developed at these companies is so valuable, and with millions or billions in transactions, that you are subject to almost government level security, right? You walk through a metal detector. You're not allowed to bring the USB sticks. I had one time a walkthrough and my car keys, and they looked and they said, "What's that?" Like, it's not a USB stick. It's a YubiKey. It's an MFA key. Yeah, that has to stay here too. I can't blame them, because if somebody leaks their code or any information inside, you sign an agreement. I will not steal your IP. People can sign an agreement and then take away a code that they can sell to competition for millions of dollars, right? And this happens. This is, if you've ever read the Flash Boys, again, HFT, the most fascinating compute area that I'm familiar with. Literally, we need to make a decision whether or not to buy or sell this stock in 10 milliseconds or 500 nanoseconds, right? This is a challenge of performance level, and nobody cares about security because everything is so air gapped and locked down that nothing can get out. Nobody trusts anything to lose anything to chance. And in the case of biggest security, I think, scandal in the last 10 years, I hate to call out Intel on this, but Intel hardware was compromised at the hardware level for years. And Intel's done a lot of good for the industry. They're the number two or number one or two top contributor to the Linux community by code base.
Yeah.
And their CPUs were sacrificing security for performance. Not intentionally, it just turned out that some of their performance shortcuts and the speculative execution had some vulnerabilities. And we've seen that they had a really hard couple of years. So we have an entire generation of hardware that security-first organizations had to throw out or had to decommission just because of a hardware glitch. So you think you're writing bad software or secure software, then you put it on, for example, a cloud partner, a cloud provider, or a private cloud provider maybe that isn't secure. Suddenly you're compromised anyway. You can't necessarily trust your own cloud provider, right? A lot of the big four, I should say, right? So AWS, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle have had public vulnerabilities exposed recently. So you may be the most secure people in the world. You migrate your application to the cloud, and the cloud have compromised. And transitioning again from the US to the Europe side, you can see the US team pushing, you need to be cloud first, you need to be cloud only. And the European organization, a lot of the time, seeing terrible vulnerabilities hit their American counterparts and say, no, we're not going to be cloud first for certain workloads, right? And there's like this in crowd, like, are you cool? You're not cool unless you go to cloud. And it's an unpopular opinion to say, guess what? In particular, this bank that has the applications that only the billionaires use, they control the security, they control the hardware, the network, everything. And again, when Cloudflare goes out, they don't have that problem, right? Because they're hosting their own. So there is a case for hybrid cloud, and I am a big fan of that. And then sometimes the unpopular opinion, looking to have a hybrid cloud for security standpoint and the fact that you don't necessarily need to scale to be a Netflix, right? A lot of people think when you build, you're talking about people using AI to do an MVP or a small application. And the joke is, oh, 3 users, time to go to Kubernetes. No, you don't necessarily need Kubernetes. You don't necessarily need containerization in your cloud if you know your user base is going to be small. So not everybody is a Netflix. And also, again, the HFTs and trading companies, guess what? They can handle a certain threshold of SLA. If Netflix has an outage and my video stream starts buffering for 3 seconds, big deal. If I place a trade and suddenly my trading system goes down for 3 seconds, that could be a lot of money. So there's a different threshold for pain in the SLA. And I think that's one thing, interestingly, that AI is not necessarily a fix for. I love you go and ask an AI, I've got this application and this many users and this is my use case. Do I need to be in cloud? And AI is essentially taking my job now and consulting on infrastructure. So it's a lost art now. The trips to Middle East for 2 weeks of consulting that takes 10 minutes, guess what? AI is now doing that in seconds. So that's a dying art as well.
I think you did hit the nail on the head with like talking about that risk appetite there as well. I think again, and I think people are getting sick of the word because it does seem to be coming up all the time, but it is now the conversation is about risk and what is your risk appetite as an organization and what is the context you're doing the work in. And that is so key. Understanding for like whatever organization you work for, or if you're like, if you're working for yourself, you're a startup, what is your risk appetite? It's going to be different across the board. And that's where these nuances and these conversations are so important because sometimes it doesn't make sense for you to go into the cloud at that stage. It just depends. And it's really, from what I'm getting from this conversation is, start asking questions. Ask instead of just, creating and building, ask why, ask the questions you need before you do something rather than following the industry trends. Because like you said as well, that's how you're going to get the blend as well of like old tech knowledge and the new technology. You need to ask the questions. You can't just accept this is a new hype. Everyone's doing this. Let's do it. Oh, brilliant. Well, John, thank you so much. And I kind of want to end on this like last question, which is, you know, if there was one thing you wish people understood more about infrastructure and security from listening to this podcast episode, what would that be?
I would like to say that the true value is, it sounds taboo, but be a full stack developer, right? Full stack developer, a lot of entry levels think is I write JavaScript and Python. And no, you have to understand everything from the hardware. You have to be people that have built their own hardware, that put together their own hardware, people that have evaluated different hardware for performance and for security, all the way up through the operating system, the platform, right? The clustering, the orchestration, if need to be, and then also the obviously the application is the last bit, right? That's the bit on top. So a lot of people say full stack developer because I've taken a 2 week JavaScript course, and guess what? JavaScript is, I'm sorry to say, not the most efficient languages in most cases, right? The ability that it's a cross-platform and can be deployed anywhere is very nice, but if then you get a request from your employer to make it 10 times faster, what do? Right? You got to think of the three tenets, right? Security, performance, and functionality, right? Usability. And oftentimes, a lot of that will actually lead you to the old ways. And again, I may sound like an old man, but don't write off any of your old C and C++ developers as outdated, right? You have to be full stack developer and as well as history educated, right? How did they used to do this? Google's first server rack is on display in a museum, and it was a couple of trees strapped together, and it gave millisecond results. So I love to challenge a developer and say, okay, well, make that application run on 10-year-old or 20-year-old hardware, because hardware developers have enabled software developers to be lazy. I hate to say, on the software side, that makes us look weak, right? Software developers should be just as efficient as hardware developers. You shouldn't just get new hardware and some of your applications. So yeah, definitely have some old and new mixed.
Yeah, that's so brilliant. I think that's such a great note to end on, just mixing the old and the new. Thank you so much, John, for your time today. This was fantastic. And that's a wrap. What I really took from this conversation is that as the industry moves faster, whether it's AI assisted development or vibe coding, the fundamentals still matter. Code review, sensible defaults, credential hygiene, and being honest about risk appetite. I also love John's perspective on blending the old and the new, because a lot of new problems are just familiar ones showing up in different clothes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you know someone who's building fast right now, whether it's in DevOps, DevSecOps, or engineering leadership, please send them this episode. Thank you so much for your time today and for listening to Cybersecurity in Focus. I hope I'll see you next time.